Let's conclude the chapter by making a few more additional points of CO2 impact. This is a much more broad schematic representation of the cascading effects of climate change impacts on food security and nutrition. So not just CO2, but of course changes in atmospheric concentrations. We talked about ozone a lot, CO2, methane, N2O. Here we are focusing on CO2, and climate change we have already talked about broadly in terms of agroecosystems. There is also land degradation, water availability, changes in temperature, sea level rise, salinization, extreme events, and so on. We will not go into these aquatic stuff here, but agricultural production and post-harvest is going to affect price, quantity, quality, market trade, incomes, food prices, agricultural and other livelihoods, and affecting eventually food security and nutrition. So it always comes down to, just like water, availability, access, utilization, and stability. Right, so there is always this need to also rely or increase, for example, biofuels, bioenergy. But how does it affect availability and access, utilization and stability of livelihoods, and so on? These are also direct and indirect effects of CO2. But coming much more closer to the nutrition's percentage decline in protein content of food crops at the elevated CO2 concentrations anticipated by the end of this century relative to ambient CO2. So you can see here percentage change in protein concentration under elevated CO2. Barley, potato, rice, soy, and wheat. So soy seems much more robust. So numbers in the parentheses here represent the number of published studies from which average and standard errors are derived. So you can see that there is lots of studies focused on wheat and soy, but there are a reasonable number of studies on barley, potato, and rice as well. And barley seems to be losing most of the protein under elevated CO2, but all of them are losing protein. Okay, also includes micronutrients like iron and zinc, which can cause all kinds of problems, which lead to reduced immunity and health issues as well. Summary of changes in efficacy of weed species responses to herbicide application at manufacturers' recommended dosage as a function of CO2 concentration. So here is an indirect effect where a CO2 increase and warming is going to make weeds, like the harmful algal blooms that we talked about in the oceans and freshwater bodies. Weeds are also terrestrial ecosystem responses to warming and CO2 increase. So you can see the weed species here. The photosynthetic pathway C3 and C4 we haven't talked much about, but basically the number of CO2 atoms used in photosynthesis are different, and they have evolved over time to respond to differently to the temperature of the atmosphere and the amount of CO2 available. So it does have relevance in the sense, if C3, for example, do not do so well in increased CO2 levels, then many of the C3 crops, like cereals, may get reduced crop yields under high CO2, which we know already. So, okay. So, Canada thistle, Dallas grass, lamb's quarter, love grass, road grass, and so on. And change in efficacy is declined in many of them, as shown by these studies. So this is a good example of how the cascading impacts actually work. We are using fossil fuel for our lifestyles, which are very energy intensive. We're increasing CO2. CO2 increase leads to temperature change, precipitation change, which of course leads to a lot of plant response changes and species response changes. So invasive species like weeds may respond much more aggressively to the changes in CO2. But then, to get rid of them, the herbicide efficiency may go down in warmer temperatures and increase CO2 as well. Okay, so that again leads to loss of biodiversity, contamination of water and air, and nutrition problems, food production problems, and so on. Here, in terms of what research needs are identified by these authors, in regard to they do this for pharmacology, toxicology, contact dermatitis, and so on. I'm just going to use the example of aeroallergens because the others are not so specific. They are broader, mostly about data needs and lack of understanding and so on. In regard to climate, CO2 and aeroallergens, research priorities include aeroallergens is basically study of pollen and other bacteria and so on that are airborne and how they affect human health, and generally mold, fungus, pollen, other bacteria. We talked about Kawasaki disease and meningitis and so on as well. But here we are talking about the development of long-term multi-decadal pollen and spore data sets that use consistent methods for quantification, qualification, and monitoring of pollen counts and aeroallergen concentrations at regional and national level. So in this context, it's CO2 and plants and aeroallergens related to plants. Surveillance information from emergency room visits to help clarify the epidemiology of extreme weather events and climate in the context of aeroallergen exposure and asthma. Increased recognition of the role of plant-based pollen production in international assessments of climate change impacts. Initiation of urban ecological studies to help identify and manage allergenic plants to minimize aeroallergen exposure. Additional research to determine potential synergies between aeroallergens and human pollution. Cooperation and quantitative comparisons between healthcare professionals and plant biologists to establish a common set of pollen and climate indices for additional research and modeling efforts. Okay. Let's just look at, to keep in mind the things we have to worry about. Here are examples of drugs derived from natural sources. These are the various plants going from willow to curare, and these are the locations where they are harvested for drugs like aspirin, digoxin, vinblastine, taxol, quinine, atropine, morphine, codeine, and turbocurarine. So these are also great concern, how the narcotics and other plants are responding to CO2 and warming, and they're used for these various purposes like fever and pain, cardiac arrhythmia, pain relief, malaria, of course, non-depolarizing muscle relaxant, and so on and so forth. So gives us a sense of all the things we have to worry about in terms of plant response leading to negative health outcomes versus medicinal plants losing their efficacies, their yields and so on with CO2 increase as well. Here are some examples of non-commercialized medically important plants. These are the plants: Eukarya tomentosa, Arnica montana, Actea racemosa, Cassia occidentalis, and Pilocarpus. They are the locations here, and these are the uses from arthritis to breast milk inducer, glaucoma, diuretic. So wide range of applications. These are not yet commercialized, but they are medically important. So biodiversity loss also has to be worried about in this context of all the medicinal plants and how they may be responding to increased CO2 and associated impacts like humidity increase, temperature increase, extreme rainfall events, winds, and so on. Okay, so this concludes this chapter on CO2 increase, plant response, and some of the health outcomes, direct and indirect. I didn't go too much into the details of pharmacology and toxicology, contact dermatitis, and so on, but there is not a whole lot of solid connections made there, but intuitively they are important, and some good points are made in the book chapter that you can read up. I usually tend to obviously include figures which can be used to explain the concepts and issues and so on. When it's just text, I tend to not pay a whole lot of attention to them, but don't think that they are not important. You must read the book to go with these podcasts, and you can use these as just help and not the complete story, right? You know how to do that.